So, every once in a while, my job or my role requires me to work more than just one day a week. And, yeah, okay. So I did this recently. It was one of the other days of the week I had to work, and I was meeting with a few other pastors. And there was one of these, local guy that I didn't know very well. And in the middle of the meeting, kind of before, after, we had a few conversations. And you've been in some of those settings where you have a conversation with somebody and you walk away and think, man, that was good. I enjoyed talking with him. I enjoyed talking with her, and maybe I should follow up a little bit. And so, I felt that. I enjoyed the conversation. Felt like we kind of connected on a couple, pastor things that, we, do. And so later that day, I shot him a text and I said, hey, man, I really enjoyed talking earlier. Would love to grab some coffee sometime. Totally normal. At least it felt that way when I first sent it, because, I sent the text and a couple minutes go by. Not a big deal yet, nothing yet, but he didn't respond. And again, still not a big deal, but then 10, 15 minutes go by, still didn't get a response from this guy. And so now I'm thinking, did I make this weird? Should I? So I go back, I do what you do. I went back and I read the text, and now the text, sounds a little different. Now I'm like, maybe I read into it too much, might have been a little too much. Kind of feels like I went from casual to this guy maybe thinks I, want to be best friends. And so I've got this whole narrative running in my head already because he hasn't responded yet. And then the more time goes by, now I'm, kind of rewriting everything in my head and thinking, man, I should have said this differently. Why did I say would love to, right? That feels so aggressive. Should I just said, hey, maybe sometime, that's so much safer. And now, I'm not even thinking just about the text, but I'm thinking about all those that meeting that we had that day. Did I misread the whole conversation? Does this guy think I'm annoying? Is he even going to remember who I am? I was thinking, what if we have, we've got this meeting again next month. What if I show up, right? And it's going to be real awkward, right? Because I was like, hey, I sent you that text, right? And do I bring it up? Do I just pretend? And so I'm overthinking, right? I am overthinking this, and you do this. Right, and so it goes to that evening, that next morning, and still no response, no text back. And I'm like, what in the world? Did I have the wrong number? Or is this guy's a weirdo? I don't know. Finally, almost 24 hours later, the guy texts back. And I open the text. It says, what about Friday? I was like, all right, such a relief, because I had built this up in my head that this guy thinks I'm, some creep, some weirdo, some I don't know, and he's not going to respond to me. And then I might have to see him down the road. It's all going to be weird. But in my mind, I had written this whole story about why or why not, and why didn't he respond. And we all do that. We all kind of write that story. We all kind of have that narrative. When we don't have all the details, we all kind of write our own story and kind of fill in the blanks along the way. And sometimes it can be with small stuff, right? It's like maybe with a text or a conversation, something minor. But sometimes that story that starts running around in our head, that narrative that we kind of start to tell, sometimes it's not small at all. Sometimes, and you might be walking through it right now, sometimes when we're going through some really difficult stuff, some really challenging things, we start to tell that story. We start to write that narrative. We start to fill in the gaps, right? You don't have all the information, and so you start kind of filling in the spots, especially when you're going through something really difficult, and especially when we don't have the answers to why you're going through it and why you're struggling through that. And so that's just a tendency for us where we kind of spiral with that conversation, especially when we're feeling a little out of control, or we're feeling a little, feeling the pressure or feeling the tension of some of the things that have come our way in life. Now, some of us, when we're doing that, sometimes we turn it inward. It's, what did I do wrong? We kind of turn it back on ourselves, and why can't I seem to get these things right? Or why does this always keep happening to me? Sometimes that story we turn back in on ourselves. I think other times we push it outward, right? Because we've been hit with something, we've got some difficult situations, feel really out of control with some of the circumstances of our life, and so it comes out. We get frustrated with other people. We kind of get short with the people around us, and sometimes even everything and maybe everyone always feels like they're in the way. And other people, when we're hit with some of that stuff, we try to outrun it, right? I'm going to stay busy. I'm going to distract myself. I'm just going to try to move on to the next thing and ignore what's happening in my life. But underneath any of that, however we respond, it's the same struggle. That anytime something feels off or something feels, we feel the pressure, and we're just trying to make sense of it all. And we start telling that story. We start writing that narrative. We're trying to fix it, and maybe we're trying to forget it, trying to fight it. But that story, it's just a natural, I think, human response when we don't have all the details and we don't see all the pieces and we don't see it how it lines up. It's tough. And I think the problem, though, that story then, so often when we just let it keep running in our head of why I'm dealing with this and why didn't this work out the way, and you got all these questions, I think so often when we let that story run and run and run and run, it starts to feel true at some point. Well, they didn't respond, and so what's the problem? That felt really weird, and so maybe they're upset with me, or this keeps happening in my life, and so maybe I'm the problem. And that just tends to be, I think, how we navigate some of these things in our lives when we feel out of control. And that's one thing. If you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, like if somebody, invited you in this morning, or you're joining us online and you're not sure where you stand with faith, you're not sure where, kind of Jesus and church fits into your life. It's one thing, if that's you. But I think this topic, this thing, this story that we start to tell ourselves, I think it gets even more challenging if we are a believer. Because, all of a sudden now, as a believer, you start to add some more questions to it. It's not just you're questioning what's happening. All of a sudden you're like, man, what's God doing in this? If you're a follower of Jesus, you're all of a sudden thinking, this is complicated because now it's not just life, it's really spiritual. And God, are you involved in this? Or God, I'm going through this and this isn't easy, and are you trying to tell me something through this? Or maybe, God, I didn't plan on this and this came out of nowhere. Did I miss something somewhere? Or maybe, and here's the question maybe you've asked before, God, are you just not as close as I thought you were? Are you just not as close to me? I'm going through this, God, and it feels like you're not as close as I thought you were. And I think anytime as we're going through some of the difficult things of life, we can end up in that spiral and start to tell that story and start to have that narrative and start to fill in the gaps of the pieces of the story that we don't know. And it becomes challenging is that if that story is off, everything that follows will be off too. And so what I want to do this morning, I want to take a look at something Peter was one of Jesus' disciples. He wrote a few letters to churches in the first century. And there's something that he says, I think, that is so important when it comes to that story that you and I start to tell anytime that we're going through some difficult, challenging, out-of-control things in our lives. So Peter, he's writing to people who probably feel exactly like maybe even you do right now in this moment. That you're feeling it. Things feel off. Peter's writing to people who life feels a little uncertain for them, and the pressure is real. And it might be even that their assumption is like yours, that something's wrong. But Peter, as he steps into this, he speaks directly into moments like this. And so we'll pick it up in 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 12. And this is what he says. He says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised. Don't get caught off guard at the fiery trials that you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you." And I love how Peter starts it off when he says those two words, dear friends. In the original Greek, it literally means beloved. And here's Peter. He's not correcting from a distance. He says, beloved. He says, dear friends. He's leaning in. This is personal for Peter. This is, I really care what's happening in your life. This is, I know what you're feeling, and I see what you're going through, and he says, I want to help you make sense of it. And so he says, don't be surprised. And that sounds simple, but you know that's not. Because the word surprise, it actually means don't treat this like it's something foreign. Don't treat what's happening in your life. Don't treat these trials like it doesn't belong. In other words, he's saying the moment you're in, And I get it. The thing that feels off, the thing that has you asking, why is everything so challenging? Why is everything so difficult? Why does this feel the way it does right now? Peter says, here's what I need you to do. I want you to have the right story. He says, stop labeling it as something that shouldn't be happening. Because Peter knows what you do. He knows what I do when things feel off. I just assume something's wrong or something's broken or maybe I messed something up or maybe I missed something or maybe God's trying to get my attention. So Peter says, what if that assumption that we naturally go to, what if it's off? What if it's off? Because the problem isn't just what you and I are going through. It's what we're calling it. It's the story that we're kind of letting spiral in our head. He says, you're calling it that something's wrong, something's not right. But Peter says, no. This shouldn't be strange at all. Trials happen in life. Life is difficult. It shouldn't surprise you. And so then he uses the phrase fiery trials, and he's not using that randomly. It's this language of refinement, like metal in a fire, which means this isn't just pressure, that there's some purpose here. There's something happening here. There's a process that's happening. There's purpose behind it. In other words, I get it. That it might feel like something's wrong. But I need you to see the story a little bit different. I need you to write this story a little bit different. It might just be that this is something that God is using. That you're not just experiencing pressure. There might be a process of God is doing something in you or through you as you are going through this. And so he says, here's the story. I'm coming to you as someone who loves you and cares for you, and I know what's going on, and I know what you're struggling with, and I just want you to see that you shouldn't be surprised by some of these things. And it might just be that the very thing that has you questioning, God, where are you and what are you doing? It might just be that there's some purpose and there's a process in it. And so Peter says, I want to make sure that you got the right story running around in your head. And that if you label it as something's wrong or something's off or this shouldn't be happening, that's likely not the right direction. And so he starts there. And then he says this. He says, instead. I love it. He says, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fire trials that you're going through as if something strange were happening to you. But he says, Instead of being surprised when life gets hard, instead of being surprised when things aren't going your way, instead of assuming that something's wrong, instead of assuming that something's broken, instead of assuming that, I messed up something, instead of telling yourself the story, maybe God's trying to just get my attention, he says, instead, be very glad. Be very glad. Now those words, it feels like he means well. And you've probably had somebody say something like that while you're in the middle of something difficult, right? They're trying to help, but it doesn't really help. Oh, just stay positive. Right? You've had somebody say that. Everything happens for a reason, right? You're going through something difficult and something challenging, and it's all you can think about, and that, it's all going to work out. And you're just sitting there thinking, no, that's not that helpful. Because when you're in it, when you're in the middle of that, it doesn't feel good. It feels heavy. It feels confusing. It feels like something's off. And so Peter is here. He says, be glad. Be glad when I'm dealing with tension in my marriage. Be glad when I'm trying to figure out how to pay the bills. Be glad, Peter, when I'm walking through something with my kids and I'm not even sure what to do. I don't know what you're asking me to be glad about. Because this moment, Peter, doesn't feel like anything to celebrate. It feels like I just got to survive this. And depending on what you're walking through, man, that probably doesn't sound just unrealistic. That sounds so disconnected. But when Peter says be glad, it's not him minimizing what you're actually carrying. But Peter's saying, be glad. He's not saying be glad and pretend that this doesn't hurt. He's not saying, hey, be glad and just ignore that feeling and be positive. See, that's not where Peter's going with this. The word he uses for be glad, it's not about a surface level happiness. Hey, cheer up. That's not what this is. It's so much deeper than that. It's not, hey, this I'm sure this maybe isn't too bad, but you get through it. As he says, be glad, this means something. This means something. There's deeper here. There's a purpose. There's a process. And so he says, be glad. Because Peter is not asking you and I to change how you feel. What he's doing is asking us to change how we see it, to change the story that might be running in our minds as we're dealing with whatever might be going on in our lives. And so that's why he says this next. He says, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering. And to me, Peter's word, he begins to kind of shift the story here for us. He's kind of pointing us in a direction. He's kind of saying, hey, yeah, you are partners with Christ in the suffering. He's giving you some identity here. He's giving you some identity and say, hey, you're not in this alone. You're in this with Jesus. Like Jesus is in this with you. Like he's gone through this, he's gone through trials as he lived his life on this earth, and he is going through this with you. And he might actually be, I know it might not feel like it in the season, but as you're going through this trial, you are partners with Christ in his suffering. You might actually be closer to him than you actually think. Again, a completely different way to see some of the things that you and I are going through. Completely different way for us to kind of tell that story in our minds as we're dealing with something difficult. And then he continues in the next part of that verse. He says, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it's revealed to all the world. In other words, I know it's tough, and I know it's challenging, and I know it can be painful, and I know you feel the pressure, and I know you feel the tension. But this moment that you're in, or this season that you're in, is not the end of the story. Peter's pointing down the road. He's saying that there's something coming. There's something being formed even in you in this moment, something being revealed in you in this moment, which means if you and I, and this is how we do it though, if you and I only evaluate what you're going through right now by how it feels right now, Peter says, you're going to misread it. And you might just miss it. But, he says, if you see it in light of what God is doing, that allows you to see this in a bigger picture, in a bigger way. And again, Peter, as he's writing to these first century Christians that are wrestling with all this, and he says, hey, the story that you're telling, I just want to make sure that the story that's running through your mind as you're dealing with this is the right story. And he continues with this in verse 14. He says, if you're insulted because you bear the name of Christ. And I don't think, this little part, the first part of verse 14, I don't think this doesn't look like someone standing in your face, making fun of your faith. But if you're in the middle of a hard season, I think what Peter's saying here can look like this. Because you've had this. Or you're already carrying something very heavy, trying to do what you feel God leading you to do as you're navigating something difficult. And you've had somebody question your decisions. Why are you doing that? Oh, I wouldn't handle it that way. Why would you make that choice? And you're trying to do the right thing, and you got somebody close to you, and they just don't understand. You get completely misunderstood. Or maybe you're here, you're trying to navigate, get through this, trying to survive this, and you're holding on to your faith, but yet there's others that are criticizing your decisions. And so all of a sudden, maybe some of the people that you think should be the closest to you, should be the ones supporting you, now you feel some distance from them. And no matter who you are, as you're in the middle of something difficult, man, that just adds weight. It just adds weight to the whole thing. And so Peter just says, when that happens, when you're already in there, and it's a difficult situation, and the pressure is on, and you're feeling kind of maybe even attacked by people around you, he says, you're not abandoned. You're not off track. And he says this, you will be blessed, for the glorious Spirit of God rests upon you. In other words, what you're experiencing, that kind of tension, maybe you're getting some pushback from some of the people that are around you. He says, you belong to Jesus. You belong to Jesus. This is your identity. This is who you are. And Peter, he's just trying to help us write this story and make sure the story that's kind of spinning in our heads as we're going through some difficult things, that it's the right story. And he continues with this in verse 15. He says, if you suffer, however, it must not be for murder, stealing, making trouble, or prying into other people's affairs. In other words, Peter says, all suffering is not the same. Sometimes, and you know this, sometimes we suffer simply because of our own choices. And this isn't what Peter's getting at. He's saying, don't confuse consequences with your calling. Don't spiritualize something that's actually on you. Like, sometimes it's not spiritual warfare. It's just that you and I maybe made a bad decision. Sometimes it's not the enemy is attacking me. It's more, you know what? I ignored doing the right thing when I knew the right thing to do. Sometimes it's not persecution. Sometimes it's patterns. Sometimes it's habits. It's choices that maybe have caught up with you. And we've all done this. We've had those moments where something goes sideways in our lives, and instead of owning it, we try to make it sound deeper than it is. You've heard people say, well, man, God's really stretching me right now. And maybe, or maybe you bought something you had no business buying, and all of a sudden you're like, God, I need you to provide for me, right? Or maybe you've been putting off something that you know needed your attention, but now, because you put it off, now it's bigger than it was. Or maybe you knew the right thing to do, and you just said, for whatever reason, you didn't do it, and now you're feeling it. And so Peter says, those are two completely different things. And then he wraps up in verse 16. He says, but it is no shame to suffer for being a Christian. He says, praise God for the privilege of being called by his name. And here Peter kind of lands it with identity. He kind of lands it with who you are. That there is privilege of being called by his name. And I just love how Peter handles this, because he's writing to people that are going through similar things to what you and I deal with. He's writing to people that feel like everything's just out of control. He's writing to people that are afraid. He's writing to people that, don't know what tomorrow looks like. He's writing to people that aren't sure how this situation is going to end up. And all they can think about is this, and they're telling that story. They're kind of writing the ending in their mind. They're trying to figure it out. They're trying to put all the pieces together, and they're writing a story. And Peter says, hey, before you write that story without all the missing pieces, before you kind of fill in the gaps with what's going on, he says, I just need you to know. I need you to know that who you are. I need you to know that you're not abandoned. I need you to know that you're not in this alone. I need you to be telling the right story to yourself as you're going through this. That you carry his name. He mentions that multiple times in this. You carry his name, and that brings a lot with it. That your Heavenly Father is not absent. And he's trying to help you and I see. He's trying to write this story saying, hey, you got to be telling the right story in your mind. He says, this moment is not meaningless. This moment is not meaningless. This season, this trial, this difficult thing, it is not meaningless. So as you begin to tell that story, you carry his name. God is not absent, and this moment is not meaningless. And so instead of asking, God, man, what is wrong? It's more, God, what are you doing in this? And so here's what I want to do to wrap this up. I'm thankful that Peter, he uses these words, and he says, I want to help you tell the right story. I don't want you to get sidetracked. I don't want you to kind of create your own narrative. I don't want you to do anything else. I just need you to know the truth. And I want to wrap up this way. Because again, Peter, he's writing to real people in real situations, going through real pressure. And I think sometimes we're human. You're human. I'm human. We can read something like Peter's words here. Oh, it's 2,000 years ago, Laren. And it's a different group, and man, my situation, and I feel like I can't get my head above water, and I feel like, I don't know what's next, and I feel like, how are we going to get through this, and how are we going to figure this out, and, is God really, with me, and I feel like sometimes why even pray, because I don't even know if he's listening, right? I think it can seem that way so often, and we can miss how personal Peter's words can really be. And so I want to take what Peter's already said, and I want to read it again, and I want to take a moment, and I want to read it a little bit slower. I want to read it in the sense of maybe what it might sound like if he were standing up here speaking to you, knowing exactly what your situation is. And so, right where you're at, will you just bow your heads and close your eyes and just listen? Don't be surprised. Don't be caught off guard by what you're walking through right now. I know it feels off. I know it does. And I know it feels like something's wrong. And it's hard not to feel like something's wrong. But this isn't as strange as you think it is. God, the creator of the universe, your Heavenly Father, has not stepped away. You haven't missed him. And the pressure that you feel right now, the tension that you feel right now, whatever you're feeling right now, it's not pointless. No, there's something happening in it. So don't waste this moment. Lean into it. Lean into it. Because even here, I know it feels like it sometimes. I know it seems like it. I know all the factors happening around you may make you think this. But even here, you are not alone. You're actually closer to Jesus than you realize. And the very thing that makes this hard might be the very thing that reminds you who you belong to. And with heads bowed, eyes closed, real quick, this kind of help me know how to pray even this morning. If right now you're going through it and things feel completely out of your control, and you felt this too. You've been kind of writing that whole story, and you're not sure where God is at in the middle of it. If you're in just a challenging season, going through some challenging stuff, some stuff that, man, you just wish you could get through, and just not even sure, feel so off balance, just with heads bowed, eyes closed, would you just put your hand up? Just so I can know how to pray. And yeah, that's me. That's my season. That's what I'm dealing with. Yeah. Dear Heavenly Father, God, for those that raise their hand, and I'm sure there's plenty of us that they're going through some other stuff as well, God, I pray for their situation specifically. God, you know what it is. You know what the challenges are. You know what story they've probably maybe started telling in their own mind. God, I pray that they would be pulled back to your story. God, that they're not alone, that there can be purpose in this, that you're working in this, and that they're yours, that you have not abandoned them, that they can draw near to you in this season and you're not going to pull away. And so, God, I just pray that for them, that there just be that real sense of your presence in the midst of whatever they're going through. And this wouldn't just be like I left Sunday and I felt good later. No, God, I pray that this would just be a habit of ours. A habit to make sure that we're always telling the right story. That the narrative that's running around, even in the most difficult times of our lives, that narrative is always the truth that you have for us. So God, may we walk in that.